Story 1. The Forgotten Girl. The Murder of Shanda Sharer. She was 12 years old. She still collected stickers. She still called her mom Mommy. Her favorite color was purple. Her world, like many kids her age, was made up of school crushes, weekend sleepovers, and a growing fascination with everything teenage. But on a bitter January night in 1992, Shanda Sharer stepped outside to meet a friend and vanished into the hands of 4 teenage girls who would torture, mutilate, and burn her alive in one of the most brutal child-on-child murders in American history. This story isn't just about what they did to her, it's about how they got there and how a chain of obsession, jealousy, and teenage cruelty created a killing machine more terrifying than any adult predator. The day was January 10th, 1992. The town, Madison, Indiana. Shanda had recently transferred schools after some trouble with another girl, Amanda Heverin. Their relationship had been confusing, maybe romantic, maybe not, but it had turned into drama. Jealousy had flared. Another girl, Melinda Lovelace, who'd once dated Amanda, began to spiral. She was 16, volatile, and emotionally unstable. She believed Shanda was stealing Amanda from her, even though they were all just girls. Melinda wanted to scare her. At least, that's what she said. That night, 16-year-old Melinda Lovelace gathered 3 other girls. Laura Tackett, 17, troubled, gothic, fascinated by the occult. Hope Rippey, 15, easily influenced, looking to fit in. And Tony Lawrence, 15, quiet, nervous, afraid to say no. They drove to Shanda's father's house late that night. The plan, they said, was simple. Lure Shanda out, scare her a little, make her back off from Amanda, maybe rough her up a bit. That was all. At least, that's what they told themselves. Shanda was home with her father, watching TV. Around midnight, the doorbell rang. 2 girls stood outside, Hope and Tony. They told Shanda Amanda wanted to see her, that she was waiting in the car. Shanda was hesitant. She didn't know the girls well, but they were persistent. She told her dad she'd be right back, just going to talk. She never came back. Once she got into the car, Shanda quickly realized something was wrong. Amanda wasn't there, and the mood shifted. Melinda Lovelace was hiding in the back seat, and when she revealed herself, she was holding a knife. She lunged at Shanda. She held the blade to her throat, and she threatened her, telling her she was going to kill her for stealing Amanda. Shanda was terrified, but the nightmare had just begun. They drove for hours, deep into rural Madison, to a place known as the Witch's Castle, a creepy, graffiti-covered ruin in the woods that local teens use for drinking, dares, and ghost stories. There, they forced Shanda out of the car. They stripped her of her jewelry. They mocked her. Melinda punched her. Tony and Hope stood by, silent, frozen. Laurie watched with fascination. Eventually, they forced her back into the car. Shanda begged them to take her home. They didn't. Over the next several hours, they drove around aimlessly, stopping at various locations. At each stop, the violence escalated. They beat her with fists. They hit her with a tire iron. They tried to strangle her with a rope. When she didn't die, they stabbed her over and over again. They shoved her, bloodied and broken, into the trunk of the car and drove off, laughing, eating McDonald's, listening to music, as if nothing had happened. But from the trunk, Shanda was still making noises. She wasn't dead, not yet. It was now dawn, January 11th. In the early morning light, They drove to a remote field near a wooded area off a back road. There, they opened the trunk and saw Shanda, barely alive, unable to move or speak. Melinda and Laurie pulled her out. They wrapped her in a blanket, poured gasoline over her body, and set her on fire. She was still alive. She screamed. Then she stopped. They left her burning and drove away. Later that day, the charred remains were found by two hunters. They thought it was a mannequin at first. The fire had disfigured the body. But what stood out to them was that the mouth was wide open, frozen in a scream. Police were called. They had no idea who she was. Meanwhile, the girls, Melinda, Laurie, Hope, and Tony, went to breakfast. They joked about the murder. They laughed. Later, one of them would call a friend and say, "We killed a little girl last night. It was so cool." It didn't take long for word to spread. Tony Lawrence, the most frightened of the four, broke down and confessed to police. The others were arrested soon after. The details of the murder shocked the country, not just because of what they did, but because of who they were. All four girls were from seemingly normal families. All had friends. None had prior criminal records, but together they created a monster. Melinda Lovelace was the ringleader, manipulative, jealous, driven by rage. Her home life had been abusive. Her father, a former military man, was violent and controlling. Melinda showed signs of trauma from a young age. Laurie Tackett had severe mental health issues. She claimed to hear voices. She once told friends she was possessed by a demon named Deanna. Her parents were strict Pentecostals. She ran away often and dabbled in the occult. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence were followers, eager to please, afraid to resist. Together, they formed a perfect storm. The trial shocked the courtroom. The crime scene photos were so graphic that some jurors cried. Psychiatrists testified about the mental state of the girls, especially Melinda and Laurie. But no excuse could explain the cruelty. All four girls were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Because of their ages, none received the death penalty. Melinda and Laurie received 60 years. Hope received 60 years with some suspended. Tony, who cooperated early and showed remorse, received a lighter sentence, but none of them denied what they had done. Shanda Scherer was buried days later. Her mother, Jackie, collapsed at the funeral. She had to identify her daughter's remains by dental records because there was nothing else left. Shanda's father never recovered. He died years later, reportedly from alcoholism and a broken heart. Her family would later say they tried to move on. They even publicly forgave the girls, somewhat, but they would never forget. The story of Shanda Scherer is still hard to process, not because of the brutality, but because it was done by children, teenagers, girls who went to school, who listened to pop music, who kept diaries, girls who decided one night that jealousy, cruelty, and peer pressure were enough to justify taking a life. Shanda was just 12 years old. She never got to grow up. The town of Madison, Indiana was left shaken, its illusion of safety shattered. Most horrifying was the sheer normalcy of the perpetrators. These weren't monsters from the shadows. They were high school girls, kids from down the street, girls who shopped at the same mall, rode the same buses, sat in the same cafeterias. How could they do something so savage? And why didn't any of them stop it? Investigators quickly pieced together the timeline through interviews, confessions, and surveillance. The story that emerged felt like fiction, unreal in its escalation. Melinda Lovelace had been unraveling long before that night. Her relationship with Amanda Hebron had become toxic. After Amanda broke up with her and started spending time with Shanda, Melinda became obsessed. She wrote disturbing letters, scribbled violent fantasies in notebooks. She followed Amanda. She made threats, and everyone ignored the warning signs. She told multiple people she was going to hurt Shanda. Some laughed, some brushed it off. No one reported it. Then one night, she followed through. Lori Tackett was another storm waiting to break. In her journals, she wrote about murder, about Satan, about controlling others. Friends later recalled her talking about killing someone just to see what it feels like. She once brought a knife to school and claimed it had tasted blood. Her parents knew she was unstable. They sought help. She was hospitalized, but she slipped through every crack. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence were classic bystanders, swept up in groupthink and fear. They weren't killers by nature, but they didn't run. They didn't call for help. They watched, and they became part of it. On the witness stand, Tony sobbed. She told the court she wanted to help Shanda, wanted to open the trunk to stop the beating, but she was scared. She was afraid of Melinda, afraid of Laurie, afraid of being next. But prosecutors reminded her she never called 911, not that night, not the next day, not even anonymously. She went to breakfast. She laughed. That silence spoke louder than her tears. Meanwhile, Shanda's family was left to endure the aftermath. Her mother, Jackie, became a public face of the case. She spoke out against teen violence, bullying, and emotional abuse. But she also struggled privately, battling depression, PTSD, and survivor's guilt. Shanda's father, Steve, withdrew. Friends said he changed overnight. Once a joyful man, he became quiet, angry, distant. He drank heavily. He passed away years later, long before his time. Their pain never truly left, because there's no closure for something like this. Years passed. In prison, Melinda Lovelace reportedly took up dog training. She worked with a program that paired inmates with service dogs. Some said she showed remorse. Others said she was still manipulative, still trying to control how others saw her. Lori Tackett became more reclusive. She stopped speaking to most of the outside world. When she eventually became eligible for parole, Shanda's family fought it bitterly. Hope Rippey served 14 years before being released on probation. She now lives under a different name. Tony Lawrence was released the earliest and faded into quiet obscurity. None of them ever returned to Madison. Every few years, someone retells the story. A podcast, a documentary, a crime series. Each time, the details reignite the horror, the transcripts, the torture, the helplessness. People ask the same questions again and again. How could they do this? Why didn't anyone stop them? And could it happen again? The answer no one wants to hear is yes, because the seeds of this tragedy didn't grow in darkness. They grew in the open, watered by emotional neglect, peer pressure, untreated trauma, and the raw, volatile emotions of adolescence. What happened to Shanda wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a slow brewing storm that everyone saw and ignored. In the years that followed, Shanda's mother made a remarkable decision. She forgave Melinda Lovelace, not for her sake, but for her own. Jackie told reporters, "I had to forgive her, or I'd never be able to move forward. I didn't do it for her. I did it for me. I refused to let that night destroy two families." It was a gesture many couldn't understand, but Jackie knew that anger had already taken her daughter. She wouldn't let it take her too. In interviews, Melinda seemed humbled, at times even sincere. She said, "I think about her every day. I see her in my dreams. I know what I did was evil." But then in other moments, she seemed more concerned with how the media portrayed her. She called documentaries unfair. She criticized reporters. She didn't want to be seen as a monster. Even in guilt, she sought control. Some wondered if she ever truly understood what she had taken. Because Shanda wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a case. She was a girl, a real, living, breathing child, stolen from life before it had even begun. She wanted to be a vet when she grew up. She loved animals, especially her cat, Boots. She had a diary filled with hearts and glitter pen ink. She'd recently gotten her ears pierced and was proud of them. She wore purple more than any other color. She was a little girl, and she trusted the wrong people. That's what makes her story so haunting. Not the brutality, not the media spectacle, but the betrayal. She believed the girls outside that door were her friends. She believed Amanda wanted to see her. She stepped into that car thinking it was just a ride, just a conversation. That's how evil works sometimes. It doesn't come with horns. It comes with a smile, and a ride, and a lie. The headlines had faded, but the ripples of what happened that night never stopped spreading. In Madison, Indiana, the case became a legend. The kind whispered between kids who passed the ruins of the witch's castle or saw a trunk lying by the roadside and wondered. Shanda's classmates grew up carrying the trauma. Some of them transferred schools. Others withdrew from social groups. A few ended up in therapy years later, not because they witnessed the crime, but because they'd known Shanda, played with her, shared lunch with her. She was one of them, and she was gone. Not just gone, but erased, burned, dismembered, dehumanized. There's something about a murder committed by other children that breaks our understanding of good and evil. We expect brutality from monsters, from hardened killers, from strangers in dark alleys. But this? 4 girls, in a car, laughing, eating fast food, while a 12-year-old girl screamed for her life in the trunk. This wasn't a story about rage boiling over in an instant. This was methodical, prolonged, cruel, and it haunts anyone who hears it. In the years after the murder, experts on adolescent psychology began to dissect the case. What makes a teenager torture someone like that? How can empathy vanish so completely? The conclusion wasn't comforting. For some, it's a perfect storm of influences: abuse, trauma, peer dominance, and unchecked rage. But for others, it's darker, because some people, even as teens, take pleasure in causing pain. And when those people find each other, they amplify one another. They validate the violence. They feed it. That's what happened in that car that night. Melinda was the engine. Lori was the flame. Hope and Tony were the silence. Inside that group dynamic, Shanda never had a chance. She pleaded, she cried, she screamed for her mother. At one point, she asked if she was going to be taken home. Lori told her, "You'll go home. Don't worry." She didn't know that home meant a shallow ditch and a gas can. Later, when pressed by investigators, the girls admitted that they knew she was still alive when they set her on fire. They could hear her moaning. They could hear her moving. They lit the match anyway. The prosecutor in the case, Guy Townsend, wept during closing arguments. He called the murder the most evil crime I've ever seen. He said it wasn't about impulse, it was about control. Melinda wanted to erase Shanda. Laurie wanted to prove she was fearless. And the other two simply followed orders. It was Lord of the Flies in real life, a society without rules, without empathy, just fire and screaming in the woods. Some tried to blame horror movies, heavy metal, satanic panic. But this wasn't about the media. This was about untreated trauma, mental illness, unchecked aggression, and a culture of looking the other way. Melinda had been sexually abused by her father for years. She told multiple adults, teachers, counselors, and nothing was done. Laurie was in and out of institutions. She wrote about killing in her journal. She threatened classmates. Still, no one acted until it was too late. It wasn't a matter of not knowing. It was a matter of not believing or not wanting to get involved. After the trial, Shanda's mother launched a foundation in her name. Its mission, to prevent violence among teens and spread awareness of emotional abuse, bullying, and psychological red flags. She gave talks at schools. She met with at-risk kids. She sat across from teenagers and told them what happened to her daughter, not as a horror story, but as a warning. She used her pain to protect others, but even she admitted, privately, quietly, that some nights she still woke up screaming, that the image of her daughter burning never truly left her, that forgiveness was a choice she made again and again, because hate was poison. Years later, when Melinda Loveless was considered for early release, the public outcry was intense. Some said she had changed, that she had matured, that she expressed remorse, that she helped train service dogs in prison and had written to Shanda's family. But others, many others, said that change meant nothing when weighed against what she had done. And even if she did feel regret, it was too late. You don't get to unburn a body. You don't get to uncut someone's throat. You don't get to walk free from that kind of cruelty. When Hope Rippey was released, she changed her name and moved to a different state. A reporter found her years later and asked if she still thought about what happened. She said, every day. But when asked if she believed she deserved to be free, she hesitated. I don't know, she finally said. I really don't. One of the eeriest facts of the case is how ordinary that night began. Shanda had brushed her teeth, worn her favorite clothes, watched TV with her dad, told him she'd be back soon. Melinda had painted her nails earlier that day. Laurie had joked with her mom before leaving the house. Hope had giggled on the phone about a boy she liked. It was a normal night, until it wasn't. That's what makes the story stick in your throat. There was no dark figure in the alley, just 4 teenage girls and a plan. After the sentencing, Madison tried to return to normal, but something had cracked beneath the surface. The town's teenagers weren't the same. Parents were suddenly suspicious of their children's friends. Teachers watched interactions more closely. Rumors flew that more kids had known, that there was a cover-up, that Melinda had done worse things in the past. Most weren't true, but the truth was already horrific enough. A quiet fear hung over the community, because if 4 girls from down the street could burn a 12-year-old alive, what else was possible? Some students wrote poetry about Shanda. Others left notes on her grave. Years later, a teacher would confess she'd once heard Melinda talking about violence in class but hadn't reported it. She thought it was a phase, teen anger, just words. No one would make that mistake again, not in Madison. Shanda's case also sparked national debate on juvenile justice. Should teenagers who commit brutal murders be tried as adults? Should a 16-year-old who plans a kidnapping, participates in torture, and lights a girl on fire get the chance to walk free someday? Some said yes. Teen brains aren't fully developed. They can be rehabilitated. They shouldn't be sentenced to die in prison for one awful act. But others pointed to the calculated nature of the crime. This wasn't impulsive. It was sustained. It lasted 9 hours. There were countless chances to stop, and not one of the 4 did. In her adult years, Melinda Lovelace gave few interviews, but when she did, she often tried to control the narrative. She claimed trauma made her snap. She said she didn't want to kill Shanda, only scare her. But tapes of her confession told a different story. She described laughing when Shanda screamed. She described pouring gasoline and watching it take. And she described feeling nothing afterward, just relief that it was over. Lori Tackett's story took darker turns after her arrest. Prison guards said she displayed little remorse. She often talked about her dreams, many of them violent. She once told a counselor she still heard voices. Her writings from inside prison were even more disturbing than her teenage journals. Drawings of knives, women screaming, burned bodies. She never denied her role, but she never seemed to fully grasp the weight of it either. Some said she was a sociopath. Others said she was broken from birth. Either way, the girl who dragged Shanda from the trunk and helped burn her alive never seemed haunted by it. Meanwhile, Shanda's mother refused to let her daughter's name fade into just another true crime case. She launched education programs, anti-bullying initiatives, spoke in front of lawmakers and youth organizations. She made it clear what happened to Shanda wasn't an isolated act of evil. It was the end result of unchecked cruelty, peer pressure, and a culture that ignored signs until it was too late. She called it a slow murder, one that began months before the night it ended in flames. The investigators who worked the case never forgot it either. One detective said, "It was the only time in my career I couldn't sleep for a week." Another added, "I kept thinking about how she begged for her mother, even as they beat her, even as they stabbed her, because that's what gets lost in the coverage." Shanda was a child, and her final words weren't screams of anger. They were cries for home. Every detail of that night is a scar on the record. They stopped at gas stations. They changed clothes. They joked. They even kissed boys at one point while Shanda was bleeding in the car. Lori bragged that she could still hear her gasping in the trunk. When they stopped at Hope's house, Hope's parents were asleep inside. Shanda was in their driveway, locked in the trunk of a car. No one knew. No one came out. No one saved her. There was a moment, brief but real, when they considered letting her go. One of them asked, "What if we just drop her off?" Another said, "She'll tell." And the decision was made. She couldn't live because she'd seen their faces, because they didn't want to get in trouble. That was the logic. A life for their own protection. So they drove into the woods, picked a spot they thought was far enough, opened the trunk. She was still breathing, not speaking, just breathing. That's when they wrapped her in a blanket, told her it was almost over, and they were right. It was. At the funeral, Shanda's casket was closed. Her body was burned beyond recognition. Her favorite stuffed animal sat on the table beside her photo, a smiling girl with dimples and braces, frozen forever in time. Her classmates too young to process what had happened, left notes, stickers, letters. Some asked why. Some said they were sorry. Some simply cried. In prison, Melinda once said that the worst part of it all was being remembered for the worst thing I ever did. But for Shanda, there was no second chance, no redemption arc, no interviews, no dog training programs. She was dead because Melinda chose to make her worst thing into someone else's last night. In the years after the murder, the case of Shanda Sheriff became more than just a true crime story. It became a symbol of what can happen when jealousy is allowed to fester, when young minds are fed anger without restraint, when the people around them, parents, teachers, friends, choose to look away. People began to study the girls' lives in search of answers. Melinda Lovelace had grown up in a house of terror. Her father, Larry Lovelace, had been a sexual predator. He abused Melinda. He beat her mother. He bragged about violent sex and treated his daughters like property. Her mother, Marjorie, was emotionally unstable, at times complicit, at times too broken to act. Melinda was surrounded by chaos, but none of that explained what she became. Plenty of children experience trauma. They don't all become killers. So why her? Why this? Laurie Tackett's background was less overtly abusive, but deeply unsettling. Her mother was fanatically religious. Her father, emotionally distant. Laurie was a rebellious child, fascinated by death, horror, and control. She often wore black, read books about Satanism, but more disturbing than her appearance were her thoughts. She once told a friend, "I just want to see someone die." No one believed her. They thought it was goth theater, teenage angst. But she meant it, and she made it happen. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence were the outliers. They didn't have violent pasts. They weren't mentally unstable. They didn't lead to crime, but they didn't stop it either. And in that moment, when they had a choice to run, to scream, to pick up a phone, they chose silence. And silence can kill just as efficiently as a knife. That's the part that's hardest for many to accept. How close this whole story was to being preventable. How many chances there were to change the outcome before the drive, during the drive, at any one of a dozen stops. Shanda could have been saved, but the line between a thought and an action disappeared, and no one pulled the brake. Shanda's last moments weren't quick. They weren't merciful. They were full of fear, pain, and betrayal. Experts later confirmed that she was alive when she was set on fire. She tried to crawl away. The position of her arms suggested struggle. The soot in her lungs proved she breathed during the burn. She didn't die instantly. She felt it all. That detail haunted everyone involved in the investigation, the coroner, the detectives, even the jury, because we like to believe that even in horror, there's a limit, that maybe she was unconscious, that maybe she didn't feel it, but she did, and they did it anyway. The girls drove away as her body burned. They joked in the car. They talked about what to do next. One of them said, "We're going to get caught." Another replied, "Only if someone talks." The silence held for less than a day. Tony broke. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Her guilt devoured her. She went to her parents, then to the police. The house of cards collapsed. During the interrogations, police were stunned by the calmness. Melinda spoke as if recounting a school fight, not a murder. Laurie laughed at times. Hope wept, but mostly for herself. Only Tony seemed to grasp the gravity of what they had done. But it was too late for all of them, and far, far too late for Shanda. In the courtroom, Melinda's face was blank. Occasionally, she would glance at Shanda's mother. Jackie stared back with a look of stone. She wanted Melinda to feel her eyes, her pain, her hate. Later, Jackie said, I wanted her to know what she took from me. I wanted her to know that she changed me forever. But as time passed, Jackie came to a crossroads. Hate, she realized, was destroying her too. So she chose to forgive, not for them, for herself. Years later, Jackie met Melinda face to face. It wasn't for show. There were no cameras, just a mother and her daughter's killer. They spoke for 5 hours. Jackie asked hard questions. Melinda didn't dodge them. Jackie walked away not with peace, but with control. She had looked her nightmare in the eye and survived it. That meeting became a story of its own. A documentary featured it. People debated whether forgiveness was right. Some called Jackie a saint. Others called her weak. But no one could understand what she had lived with, except her, and she made her choice, not for sympathy, but for release. The grave where Shanda lies is covered with flowers. People who never met her visit every year. They leave candles, toys, notes. One reads, "You are not forgotten." Another, "I wish I could have been your friend." She would be in her 40s today, maybe a mother, a teacher, a veterinarian. But her story ended in 1992 because 4 girls decided to play God. Melinda Lovelace was released from prison in 2019 after serving over 26 years. She faded from the spotlight, changed her name, started over. Lori Tackett was released a few years before her. She keeps a low profile. Pope Rippey and Tony Lawrence vanished into new identities. But no matter where they go, Shanda's face follows. Her yearbook photo, her voice on an old home movie, her smile in the few surviving pictures. Frozen in time, innocent, gone. In the decades since her death, Shanda Sharer's story has echoed through courtrooms, classrooms, documentaries, and dinner table conversations. Not because people enjoy retelling the horror, but because they still struggle to understand how it happened. Because it wasn't random. It wasn't the work of a man in a mask or a monster in the dark. It was 4 teenage girls. And one of them said it best during her confession. "We didn't mean for it to go that far, but once it started, we couldn't stop." That sentence chills even more than the violence, because it reveals the truth no one wants to say out loud. Some murders don't come from monsters. They come from kids who choose not to stop. Shanda's name appears in academic studies now. She is a case file, a cautionary tale, a symbol. But to those who knew her, she was so much more. Her best friend still remembers her giggle. Her aunt still talks about the last Christmas they spent together. How Shanda wanted a puppy and got a kitten instead. How she loved sparkles. How she refused to go to sleep without a nightlight. She was 12. She had a favorite song, a favorite cereal, a secret crush, a plan to try out for the volleyball team. She had a life, and it was taken piece by piece, minute by minute, hour by hour, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Many people want to believe they'd act differently, that if they'd been Hope or Tony, they'd have said something, that if they'd been in Melinda's life, they would have intervened, that if they'd been Shanda's father that night, they would have said, "No, you're not going anywhere." But the truth is, most people miss the warning signs. Until it's too late, that's what makes this story so important to remember. It didn't happen in a horror movie. It happened on a quiet street, in a regular town, with regular girls. Jackie Vaught, Shandah's mother, spent years in grief counseling, years of replaying that night. What if she hadn't let her daughter go to her dad's that weekend? What if she'd transferred her sooner? What if she'd called Amanda's parents, called the school? All the what-ifs in the world couldn't bring her back. So instead, she used her grief to help others. She worked with youth programs, told her story in high schools, sat with grieving parents who lost children to violence. She became a survivor, not because she got over it, but because she refused to let it end with her. The graveyard where Shandah is buried overlooks a hill. On clear days, you can see children playing in the distance. Some of them are her age. Some are older than she ever got to be. None of them know how easily the world can turn upside down, or how evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a girl with a smile and a knife in her coat. The judge at the sentencing said something few forget. There is no punishment that fits this crime. There never could be. You cannot burn a child alive and expect prison time to balance the scales. He was right. But justice isn't about balance. Sometimes it's only about making sure the world remembers. When asked why she finally forgave Melinda, Jackie said something that speaks louder than any headline or documentary. Because she took one life, I wasn't going to let her take two. So we remember Shandah Sharer, not just for how she died, but for who she was, a daughter, a friend, a child who trusted too easily and who paid for it with her life. Her story is a warning, but also a call to listen when kids say they're scared, to speak up when someone jokes about hurting others, to act before it's too late. Because evil doesn't always come with a red flag. Sometimes it rings the doorbell and smiles. Story 2, The Dead End, the bus driver who vanished with an entire town's children. She pulled the bus into the depot one final time. No one saw her again. The children were never found. The town pretends it never happened, but the dirt remembers. This is the story of a sleepy rural town, a trusted school bus driver, and a disappearance so haunting that even decades later, no one speaks of it without checking over their shoulder. They say evil leaves a scent. But in Castor Glen, Missouri, it left a silence so loud, it still drowns out the crickets. This is the story of Marie Alcott, the woman who drove a bus full of children straight off the face of the earth. In 1987, Castor Glen wasn't even on most maps. A town of 4,000, maybe less, surrounded by cornfields and the faint scent of cattle. The kind of place where everybody knew your name, your business, and your bloodline. Marie Alcott had lived there all her life. She'd driven the same yellow school bus down the same two-lane roads for nearly 20 years. Every child in Castor Glen knew Miss Marie. She handed out peppermints, played country music on a small cassette player, and always waited an extra few seconds if she saw a kid running toward the stop. She was dependable. She was harmless. Until she wasn't. It was the last day before spring break, March 27th, 1987. Marie pulled the bus out at 6:42 a.m. sharp, like she always did. It was bus number 6, rust along the wheel wells, a cracked left mirror held together with duct tape. She picked up 19 students that morning. The sign-in sheet would later confirm each name, ages 6 through 14. She never made it to the school. The bus and everyone on it disappeared. At first, The town assumed the bus had broken down. Maybe a flat tire. Maybe Marie had radioed in and no one heard. By 9 a.m., when none of the children had arrived and no one had heard from Marie, the school called the police. By noon, every deputy in the county was combing the roads. But there was no sign, no skid marks, no broken branches, no oil leaks, nothing. It was as if the bus had driven into a hole in the earth. Parents were frantic. Some walked the roads barefoot, screaming their children's names. Some accused the school, some accused each other. One man punched a deputy, another put a shotgun in his truck and started searching the cornfields on his own. But there was no one to blame. Marie had vanished, and she'd taken their babies with her. Investigators worked for weeks. State police were called, helicopters, dogs. They found nothing, not a scrap of cloth, not a tire tread, not one piece of yellow paint. It was the largest missing persons case in Missouri history. And it went cold in 8 days. Then the dream started. Parents reported waking up at exactly 3:07 a.m. Some said they heard the sound of children laughing. Others said they smelled diesel fuel. One woman claimed she saw Marie outside her window, standing next to a burning bus. But there were no footprints, no signs of fire. The sheriff chalked it up to grief, but not everyone agreed. An old man named Clyde Behringer, local mechanic, barely spoke, walked into the sheriff's office 2 weeks later and placed a map on the desk. "I think I know where it went," he said. He pointed to a patch of woods near Red Elm Hollow, about 15 miles west. Said he saw Marie driving that way once, just after a snowstorm. Said she was alone, and she smiled at him like she didn't recognize him. He never saw her again. They searched Red Elm Hollow the next day. They found an old clearing, a collapsed barn, and something worse, drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled into the trees. The bark was scraped, the dirt torn. But again, no bus, no bodies, just a single peppermint, wrapped in red and white foil, clean, untouched, sitting on a flat rock. It was Marie's favorite. Locals started calling it the Hollow. They stopped hunting near it. Teens stopped partying in it. And the stories started to spread that sometimes you could hear the squeak of a school bus door, that a few had seen yellow through the trees, that a girl's voice whispered, "Miss Marie, I'm scared," just before the wind changed. But the case remained unsolved. The bus was gone. The kids were gone. Marie was gone. Then in 1993, 6 years later, a hunter in Kentucky found a shoe, a child sneaker, tangled in the roots of a fallen tree nearly 200 miles from Castor Glen. It was damp, but the name inside was clear, written in marker, J. Tolson. Jacob Tolson was one of the children on the bus. He was 9th DNA matched. The shoe was real. But how did it get there? There was no sign of the rest of him. No bones, no clothing, just the shoe. Was it planted? Or had the bus gone further than they thought? The FBI reopened the case. They interviewed everyone again, Marie's family, the teachers, the kids who didn't ride the bus that day. One boy, now 15, said he remembered Marie acting weird the week before. Said she kept asking if he believed in ghost roads. That she said the bus was closer to heaven than anyone realized. At the time, he thought she was joking. Now, he wasn't so sure. Marie's journals were recovered from her home. They were strange. Dozens of entries about the children being chosen. Mentions of the road behind the road. One page read, "I have seen what waits at the bend. They are not afraid. I only hope I am enough." No one could make sense of it. The final entry was dated the day before the disappearance. It read, "Tomorrow, we go. They'll be safe. I'll bring the bus home when the sky is red." Theories exploded. Some said she drove into a sinkhole. Others claimed cult involvement. One man insisted the CIA was testing experimental gas in Red Elm Hollow and used the bus as cover. But none of them could explain the peppermint or the shoe in Kentucky, or why 3 different locals swore they heard a bus engine every year on the anniversary. In 2004, 17 years later, a child's voice was recorded on a wildlife camera deep in Red Elm. It was a trail camera designed to catch deer. It recorded 3 seconds of audio. No deer appeared. But at exactly 3:07 a.m., a girl's voice said, "Miss Marie, I'm cold." No child was ever found. They built a memorial at the school in 2010. 19 names, 19 flowers, 1 bus, and an empty space where Marie's name should have gone. Because some still blame her, and others think she was trying to save them from something worse. And if you ask any old-timer in Castor Glen where the road behind the road is, they'll tell you it's not where, it's when. And they'll tell you to never drive west of Red Elm Hollow after dawn. Because if you see yellow in the trees, if you hear the hiss of brakes, if you taste peppermint on the air, it's already too late. Story 3, Room 401, The Forgotten Floor. It began with a scream. Not a loud one, not blood-curdling, just a short, strangled sound that echoed down the sterile hallway of the Briarcliff General Hospital at 2:11 a.m. Nurses didn't hear it. Security didn't log anything. But a janitor mopping the floor near the ER turned his head, paused, and whispered, "Room 401 again?" That would have been odd, except Briarcliff didn't have a room 401, not anymore. It had been sealed shut for 39 years. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night shift, people still heard the door creak. And sometimes, when someone disappeared without explanation, the staff had a name for it. They called it the Pull. Briarcliff sat on the edge of the city like a dying animal, a crumbling brutalist hospital with decades of failed renovations, yellowed paint, and an eerie silence that clung to the corners. Once a state-of-the-art trauma center, Briarcliff had become a last resort facility for the poorest patients, the mentally ill, the abandoned elderly, and the unwanted dead. Paramedics whispered it was where people went to vanish. New hires rarely lasted. Old staff refused to work night shifts unless they were desperate. And even those who stayed long enough to stop fearing the flickering hallway lights still avoided the 4th floor, especially the east wing, especially the hallway with the padlocked door marked 401 back in 1981. Room 401 was part of the psychiatric ward. At the time, Briarcliff housed dozens of patients considered untreatable, violent schizophrenics, criminally insane war vets, forgotten souls. Room 401 held a man named Ellis Granger. He was never supposed to be there. Granger was a quiet man, mid-30s, thin, pale, big eyes that didn't blink often enough. He'd been arrested for loitering at a children's playground in 1978. The police found a sketchbook in his bag. Dozens of detailed pencil drawings, all of the same little girl with no face. When asked about the drawings, Granger only said, "She watches me while I sleep. I have to remember what she looks like." They transferred him to Briarcliff after he bit off part of his own tongue during an overnight stay in County Holding. From there, the records went dark. Between 1978 and 1981, Granger was evaluated by 7 psychiatrists. Each one quit the facility within weeks. 2 committed suicide. 1 burned his notes and fled the state. The remaining 4 refused to speak of him. What's known is this: every patient placed in the room next to Granger was dead within 90 days. 1 overdosed on lithium despite the dosage never being changed. Another hanged himself with his own bedsheet, though the cameras showed no such action. A third, a mute teenager named Noah Greer, vanished from the ward without a trace. His bed was still made. There were no signs of escape, and the door had remained locked. The hospital eventually shut down the entire East Wing. They moved Granger to solitary. He died within 72 hours. Cause of death was listed as catastrophic neurological failure. The attending doctor quit that same night after claiming he'd heard the little girl scream from inside Granger's brain. He wrote that sentence in his own blood on the wall of his office before slicing both his carotid arteries with a plastic spoon. Room 401 was sealed the next day, but the problem wasn't the room, it was what the room opened into. You see, the hospital was built in layers, subfloors, service tunnels, forgotten architecture from the 1920s hospital that Briarcliff had been built over. Some of those blueprints were never transferred. Some were intentionally destroyed because there were rumors, even back then, about the space behind room 401. Some said it was a dead hallway, a bricked-off corridor filled with broken stretchers and rusted gurneys. Others said it went deeper, that it led into an older part of the building, a sub-basement built for research. When nurses asked what kind of research, the answer was always the same: don't ask questions about the 4th floor. In 2006, a security guard named Martin Vega was dared by a group of interns to spend a night outside the 401 door. They said he'd earned $300 and a bottle of whiskey. Vega laughed and brought a folding chair and a portable speaker. He was found the next morning with his eyes torn out and his tongue missing. There was no blood, no struggle, no sign of entry, just the smell of rust and a peppermint candy crushed under his boot. The hospital quietly removed the incident from internal reports, but the staff began to talk, especially the janitors, especially the ones who worked graveyard shift. They said if you stood too long near room 401, you'd hear something, sometimes breathing, sometimes footsteps, sometimes a child humming, and always, always the slow creak of the door, even though it hadn't been opened in decades. But here's where it gets worse. In 2012, a maintenance crew was dispatched to repair a burst pipe on the 4th floor. When they removed a section of the eastern wall to access old plumbing, they found something impossible. A fresh handprint on the inside of the sealed wall. It was small, child-sized, slightly smeared, and still warm. The 2 crewmen who found it quit immediately. One of them, a man named Daniel Frost, wrote in his resignation letter, "There's something alive in that wall, and it knows we found it." That letter was never filed. It was found years later in a burned locker in the basement. No one could explain how it got there, because Daniel Frost vanished the night he quit. His truck was still in the lot, his keys and wallet in the security office, but no one ever saw him again. There were calls to close the hospital, but Briarcliff was too important. too necessary for the county's underserved population. Instead, they did what hospitals do best when something unspeakable happens. They moved on, covered it up, buried it under paperwork. But not everyone forgot. A psychiatric nurse named Tara Nguyen had grown up hearing rumors about room 401. Her uncle had worked there in the 80s. He was the one who found Granger's body. He never talked about it. Until one night, in a drunk, teary confession at a family wedding, he whispered, "She's still there, the girl, the one without a fate." Tara never forgot those words. So when she took a job at Briarcliff in 2017, she started digging files, old maps, interviews with surviving staff. She found a pattern and a name that kept coming up, scribbled in margins, half erased from logs. The Watcher. It wasn't a patient. It wasn't a staff member. It was something else, a shadow that lingered in the corners of reports. A figure drawn in the margins of psych evals. A faceless girl, sometimes described as wearing a hospital gown, sometimes described as completely nude, sometimes with a head that twisted backward, always watching, always waiting, and always seen just before someone vanished. In 2019, Tara made a decision that would cost her everything. She smuggled a set of bolt cutters onto the 4th floor, waited until 2 a.m., and cut the lock on room 401. She opened the door and walked in. What she found would later be called a spatial anomaly, a hallway that couldn't exist, twice as long as the building allowed, with doors on either side, none of which were numbered. The walls were rotting, the lights flickered, and something moved at the far end. Tara ran. She never spoke about what she saw. She was found 3 days later in her bathtub, eyes torn out, tongue removed, just like Martin Vega, and written in blood on a mirror, "I see you now." After Tara Nguyen's death, Briarcliff staff tried to pretend nothing had happened. No memorial was held. Her name was quietly removed from the nursing rotation. Her locker was emptied without ceremony. But the whispers returned, louder this time. Nurses started calling in sick. Orderlies refused 4th floor assignments. And security footage from the East Wing began to show something terrifying. Shadows. Long, thin shadows that slithered against the walls without a source. One video, later leaked to Reddit by an anonymous intern, shows a night nurse pausing outside room 401. She leans forward, confused, then recoils sharply. A child's handprint appears on the glass behind her. She spins. There's no one there. She walks off. The print remains for exactly 13 seconds before fading into nothing. The video went viral, but within hours it was removed from every platform. Accounts were suspended. The uploader never came forward, but the damage was done. The story resurfaced. Room 401, the cursed room, was back in the headlines. And not everyone wanted that. Dr. Marcus Weller had been the chief administrator at Briarcliff for 9 years. A tall, cold man with steel-rimmed glasses and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He ordered a full sweep of the 4th floor, electrical, structural, security. He told reporters it was to ensure the safety of patients and staff. But privately, he gave a different order. Seal it. Again, permanently. This time, they poured concrete over the entire East Wing corridor. Room 401 disappeared behind 6 feet of reinforced cement. The hallway was reclassified as uninhabitable. The paperwork buried the same way the old stories had been, with silence. But evil doesn't respect concrete. It seeps. 3 months later, a boy named Oliver Baines age 7, was admitted to Briarcliff's pediatric unit for seizures. He was quiet, withdrawn, obsessive. He refused to sleep at night, drew constantly with crayons, chalk, even his own blood once, scratching shapes into the walls. Always the same thing, a hallway with no end, and a girl with no face. When asked about the drawings, he whispered, "She watches me sleep. She stands where the hallway ends." The psychiatrist wrote it off as childhood trauma. Oliver's parents said he'd been perfectly healthy before the visit to Briarcliff, that he never saw horror movies, never read scary books, and yet, when tested with image prompts, he consistently selected photos matching the long-sealed Room 401 corridor, even though he'd never been told it existed. One night, at 3:07 a.m., Oliver disappeared from his room. Security footage shows him walking calmly through the hallway. He stops, turns toward a blank section of wall, smiles, and vanishes. Not out of frame, he vanishes on camera, mid-step. The video cuts to static, and when it resumes, the hallway is empty. The hospital issued a statement calling it a technical glitch. But the guard on duty that night resigned the next morning. Before leaving, he made a single note in the incident report: "Don't let her in." That same week, the fire alarms went off 3 separate times, always at 3:07 a.m., always in the pediatric wing. There was never any smoke, just the scent of iron, and a faint trail of wet footprints, leading nowhere. A task force was formed, private, off the books. They called themselves the Gray Team, a mix of ex-military psychologists and consultants from institutions no one had ever heard of. Their purpose? To investigate anomalous phenomena on hospital grounds. And their target? Room 401. What they discovered has never been publicly released, but leaked documents reveal fragments of the investigation. Infrared scans showing door-shaped temperature drops in random walls. Audio recordings of a child humming in ultrasound rooms. Journal entries from staff describing looping dreams that always end with a girl holding a candy-striped hand. The Gray Team set up camp on the 3rd floor, directly beneath the sealed corridor. They used ground-penetrating radar, seismic mapping, and atmospheric sensors. What they found wasn't logical. The space above them was moving, changing shape. At night, their instruments showed the 4th floor stretching, literally growing by several meters before shrinking again. And then came the knock. It started as a single tap at 3:07 a.m., then another, then 3 in a rhythmic pattern. One of the team members, a woman named Dr. Lee Rayner, recorded it. She analyzed the spacing and realized something chilling. It was Morse code. The message, "Let me out." Within days, Dr. Rayner was gone. The others claimed she'd left in the night. Her belongings were untouched, her research notes missing, and scratched into the ceiling above her bunk, with what appeared to be her own fingernails, were the words, "I opened the door." The Gray Team disbanded. What few files remained were classified, and Briarcliff was once again left to rot under the weight of its secrets. But people kept dying, or worse, disappearing. By 2023, the hospital had lost 14 staff members to unexplained vanishings. 9 of them had one thing in common. They had all worked night shifts on the 4th floor at some point in the last year. Then, a breakthrough. A woman named Dr. Eliza Mears, a neurologist with a background in sleep disorders, discovered a pattern in the patient's brain scans. All of them, including Oliver, had abnormal spikes in the same frequency band, 3.07 hertz. She called it the pulse. It was strongest near the fourth floor, and it seemed to grow stronger during REM sleep. Eliza theorized that the hospital itself, or something within it, was inducing shared dream experiences. That maybe, just maybe, the girl wasn't real. She was a thought form, a tulpa, a nightmare given life by repetition and fear, until she met her. It was 3:07 a.m. when Eliza woke up. She was in her office, head down, drool on the desk. The lights were off. Her phone was dead. And standing in the corner near the window was a child. Not moving, not breathing, just watching. She had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, blank skin where features should be, and in her hand, a peppermint, red and white, still wrapped. Eliza tried to scream, but her mouth was gone. She was found hours later, curled into a ball, tongue bitten off, hands clenched so tightly around her ears they had to be broken to remove them. She survived, but she never spoke again, only rocked slowly in place, whispering the same word over and over. Listen, 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 listen. And so we return to the beginning, to room 401. Still sealed, still buried, still waiting. The hallway is quiet now. The hospital pretends the east wing doesn't exist, but every so often, when the air is still and the lights flicker, you'll hear it, a creak, a knock, and the sound of small feet moving towards you. On November 3rd, 2023, a new hospital administrator arrived at Briarcliff. Her name was Dr. Sasha Lynn. She was 37, with a reputation for cleaning up failing hospitals and cutting through bureaucratic rot. No nonsense, impeccably dressed, believed in data, not superstition. Within her first week, she'd fired 5 staff members, replaced 2 department heads, and had plans drawn up to gut the entire 4th floor and turn it into a trauma ward. She called the sealed corridor a tragic waste of space. When someone warned her about room 401, she smiled politely and said, "I don't run hospitals based on ghost stories." She reopened the East Wing, ordered contractors to begin concrete demolition. They refused. 2 of them quit on the spot. One called in a priest and left town with his family that very night. But Sasha didn't back down. She brought in a private demolition crew from out of state. No one told them about room 401, not officially. On November 12th, at 10:03 a.m., the first chunk of concrete was broken open. Behind it, not a hallway, not a wall, just empty space. A long black void stretching beyond the reach of flashlights. The workers stepped back. One of them tossed a glow stick into the hole. It vanished. No sound, no bounce, no floor, just gone. They sealed the breach within the hour, but by then it was already too late because something had come out. The nightmares began immediately, not just in the East Wing, all across the hospital, doctors, nurses, patients, even a child in a coma, all waking at 3:07 a.m., screaming the same thing. "She's in the walls." Sasha called it mass hysteria, scheduled psych evals, threatened termination for anyone spreading mythology. She even slept overnight on the 4th floor herself as a statement. She lasted 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, she was found on the floor of her office, bleeding from both ears. Mouth sewn shut, no thread, no needle. The skin sealed as if grown that way. She couldn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, she only said one thing: "She's not a ghost," and then she resigned. The hospital board panicked. They shut down the East Wing again, but it didn't help. because the girl was no longer trapped behind concrete. She was in the wires, in the lights, in the hum of the vents. She was part of the building now, and she was growing stronger. Technicians started reporting flickers on the hospital monitors. Patient vitals would flatline, then return to normal. Security cameras looped the same 13-second clip over and over. Lab equipment would display names, real names, of children who were never admitted, who had no files. One of them, Oliver Baines. Another, Noah Greer, the mute boy who vanished in 1981. He'd be over 50 now, if he was still alive. And then, something happened that couldn't be ignored. On Christmas Eve at precisely 3:07 a.m., the entire hospital lost power for 66 seconds, just over a minute. When the lights came back, 7 patients were missing. No alarms, no forced doors, no bodies. They were just gone. One nurse, who had been holding a patient's hand when the outage began, found only a peppermint candy in the palm when the lights returned. That night, the girl's name appeared for the first time, not spoken, not written, just whispered, over and over, through radios, through pagers, through vents. One word, marrow. It made no sense until a retired doctor, one of the few still alive from the Ellis Granger era, combed forward. His name was Dr. Halford. He was 92, half blind, living in assisted care, but when he heard the name, he cried. Said it was what Granger used to scream at night. Said Marrow wasn't a name, it was what she was. Not a ghost, he said, a Marrow child, born in the bone of the building, fed by pain, shaped by sleep. Then he begged them to burn the hospital down. No one listened, because by then Briarcliff wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and the girl, Marrow, had become its voice. Staff began quitting in waves. Entire shifts walked out mid-round. Medical records corrupted themselves. Anesthesiologists blacked out during procedures. And room 401, it was sealed again. Welded, bolted, bricked. The whole hallway filled with concrete and steel. But it didn't stop her, because now she was everywhere. The janitors were the first to accept it. They spoke of seeing her in reflections, in the wet shine of freshly mopped floors, in the shimmer of biohazard glass. They left her offerings, peppermints, dolls, drawings, anything to keep her from following them home. Some say it worked, others say nothing works. Not when a child born from death and silence decides she wants more. Not when Marrow starts whispering new names. Not when she starts pulling from beyond the hospital walls. Because that's the part no one expected. The expansion. The disappearances began spreading. First to families of former patients, then former employees, then their children. A nurse who worked at Briarcliff for only 3 days, in 2005 woke up to find her daughter missing. The only clue? A crayon drawing under her pillow, a hallway, a faceless girl, and a door labeled 401. People tried to warn the public. YouTube videos, blog posts, podcasts. Most were deleted. Some went viral, only to disappear within hours. One Reddit AMA, hosted by a former intern, ended abruptly when the host typed, "She's behind me." The post locked, the account deleted, and so Briarcliff remains, its walls humming with unseen breath, its vents echoing with soft footsteps, and room 401 still sealed, but only physically, because the real door isn't in the hallway, it's in you, in the moment your dream loops, in the second your alarm skips, in the hush between your breath and your scream. She is there, waiting, not a ghost, not a demon, something worse, a child born from the marrow of forgotten pain. And she has your name now. The hospital tried one last time, January 4th, 2025. A private contractor was hired by a silent backer, untraceable shell company, no logo, no billing history. The team came with advanced tools, LIDAR scanners, EEG mesh drones, spectrum analyzers. They were told it was a reality sink, that the building existed where it shouldn't, that the room was a wound that never clotted, and that the entity within wasn't tethered by walls. The team didn't laugh, they didn't ask questions, they only nodded. And when they entered the East Wing, everything electronic failed. Watches melted, batteries drained. One drone captured 4 seconds of footage before going dark. It showed a hallway with no ceiling, dozens of doors that blinked, yes, blinked like eyelids. And at the far end, a figure standing, thin, small, motionless, its head tilted slightly, faceless, a single peppermint at its feet. The team never left. Their vehicle remained in the lot for 5 days before being towed. Inside were 13 peppermints and a crayon sketch of a mouthless child sleeping inside a building made of bones. They were never named in the news. But in the hospital's basement archives under restricted files, their case is labeled simply absorbed. That same week, a leak came from a whistleblower inside the state health department. He claimed Briarcliff was being classified as a type red site. Not because of infection, not because of radiation, but because the location was no longer stable. That the building was growing geometrically impossible, that room 401 had replicated itself, that there were now 8 unlisted hallways behind the walls, and that in every one of them a girl had been seen. Always still, always watching, sometimes humming, sometimes smiling. The public didn't believe it until the ripples started. A woman in St. Louis woke up in a hotel bathtub with dried blood around her mouth. The word marrow was carved into the tile behind her. She had never been to Briarcliff, didn't know anyone who had. But her brother? He was a nurse there in 1991, disappeared after 3 weeks. The connection wasn't coincidence, it was inheritance. Like a virus passed through blood, marrow wasn't just haunting the hospital, she was growing. She was a system, a seed, a memory rewriting itself into the DNA of place. And so the government quietly decommissioned Briarcliff, not with dynamite, not with demolition, just silence. No ambulances, no referrals. The roads were rerouted, the GPS was altered, the name was scrubbed from records, and within months, it was forgotten. Maps showed forest. Satellite images glitched. Local police stopped responding to calls from nearby areas because they knew what the rest of the world refused to believe, that the building wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And the girl, she wasn't waiting anymore. She was choosing. Last known log from a rescue worker dispatched to investigate a reported fire near the old hospital site. It's not a building anymore, it's a skeleton. And the rooms breathe. The doors open like mouths. The lights aren't electric. They're watching. I think I'm inside her. I think she's dreaming me. I see the hallway. I see the candy. I see the transmission cut off. His body was never recovered, only his boots. Inside them, 2 peppermints, wrapped, perfect, untouched. So if you ever dream of a hallway with too many doors, If you ever hear humming with no source, if you ever find a peppermint under your pillow, though you don't remember buying any, don't open your eyes, don't get out of bed, don't follow the sound, because it's not a dream, it's a memory trying to reclaim you. Room 401 remembers, and now so do you.